The small town of Havenwood, nestled in the heart of Vermont, was no stranger to harsh winters. But this year, Mother Nature seemed determined to test the resilience of its residents. As February rolled in, bringing with it a relentless barrage of snowstorms, the townsfolk hunkered down, their spirits buoyed by the warmth of community and the promise of spring just around the corner. Clara Thompson, a 60-year-old widow with silver hair and kind eyes, had called Havenwood home for the better part of 4 decades. Despite the bitter cold and treacherous conditions, she stubbornly clung to her daily routine. Every morning, come rain or shine, or in this case, snow, Clara would bundle up in her warmest coat, pull on her sturdy boots, and set out for a brisk walk around the neighborhood. On this particular morning, as Clara carefully navigated the snow-covered sidewalks, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The usual stillness of the winter landscape was interrupted by an almost imperceptible sound, a faint whimper carried on the wind. Pausing mid-step, Clara cocked her head, straining to hear. There it was again, a soft, pitiful cry that tugged at her heartstrings. Without hesitation, she veered off her usual path, following the sound towards a snow-covered ditch by the side of the road. As she approached, the cries grew louder, more desperate. Clara's heart raced as she peered into the ditch, her eyes widening at the sight before her. There, half buried in a snowdrift, was a beautiful golden retriever. The dog's fur was matted and dirty, her body thin and shivering from the cold. But what truly broke Clara's heart was the heavy chain around the dog's neck, binding her to an old tire that had been carelessly tossed into the ditch. "Oh, you poor thing," Clara murmured, her voice thick with emotion. As she knelt beside the dog, she noticed movement beneath her, 6 tiny bundles of fur, no more than a few weeks old, huddled close to their mother for warmth. The mother dog looked up at Clara with soulful brown eyes, a mix of fear and hope evident in her gaze. Despite her obvious distress, she didn't growl or snap. Instead, she seemed to sense that Clara was there to help, and she gently nuzzled one of her puppies closer to her body. Clara's mind raced. She couldn't leave them here, they'd freeze to death in this weather. But how could she possibly move a mother dog and 6 puppies by herself? She was no spring chicken, after all. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she said softly to the dog, reaching out slowly to let her sniff her hand. "I'm going to get you out of here. I promise." With a determination that belied her years, Clara turned and hurried back home as quickly as the snowy conditions would allow. Her modest house, just a few blocks away, had never seemed so far. By the time she reached her front door, she was out of breath, her cheeks flushed from exertion and the biting cold. Clara's hands shook as she fumbled with her keys, her mind focused solely on the abandoned family she'd left behind. Once inside, she didn't even bother to remove her snow-covered boots. Instead, she rushed to gather supplies, blankets, towels, a bolt cutter she'd kept after her late husband's passing, and a large garden cart they'd used for hauling mulch and plants. Loaded up with supplies, Clara set out once more into the storm. The wind had picked up, driving the snow horizontally and making visibility poor. But Clara pressed on, the cart bumping along behind her as she retraced her steps to the ditch. When she arrived, her heart sank. The snow was falling so heavily that it had almost completely covered the mother dog. Only her head was visible above the white expanse, her eyes closed as if she'd given up hope. The puppies were nowhere to be seen, buried beneath their mother and the ever-accumulating snow. "No, no, no," Clara muttered, dropping to her knees beside the ditch. "Hold on, girl. I'm here now." With trembling hands, Clara began to dig. The snow was wet and heavy, clinging to her gloves and soaking through to her skin. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not when lives were at stake. As she cleared the snow away, she spoke softly to the mother dog, her voice a steady stream of encouragement. "That's it, sweetheart. You're doing so well. We're going to get you out of here, you and your babies. Just hold on a little longer." Finally, after what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, Clara uncovered the last of the puppies. They were alive, thank goodness, but barely moving, tiny balls of fur dusted with snow, their eyes tightly shut against the harsh world they'd been born into. Now came the hard part. Clara took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she knew would be a difficult and potentially dangerous task. She reached for the bolt cutters, her arthritic fingers protesting as she gripped the heavy tool. "Easy now," she murmured to the mother dog as she approached with the cutters. "I'm going to get this awful chain off you. Just stay still for me, okay?" To Clara's amazement and relief, the dog remained calm as she worked to cut through the thick chain. It took all of her strength, her arms shaking with the effort, but finally, with a resounding snap, the chain fell away. Free at last, the mother dog struggled to her feet. She was weak and unsteady, but the look she gave Clara was one of pure gratitude. Gently, ever so gently, she began to nose her puppies, encouraging them to move. Clara worked quickly, wrapping each puppy in a soft towel before placing them in the cart. The mother dog watched anxiously, but made no move to stop her. It was as if she understood that this strange human was her family's only hope for survival. Once all 6 puppies were safely nestled in the cart, Clara turned her attention to their mother. "Okay, sweetheart," she said, holding out her arms. "Your turn. Can you make it into the cart?" The dog hesitated for a moment, looking from Clara to her puppies and back again. Then, with a soft whine, she gathered her remaining strength and allowed Clara to help her into the cart. She immediately curled protectively around her babies, her body providing what little warmth she could muster. Clara stood back, surveying her handiwork. The cart was full to bursting with dogs and blankets, far heavier than anything she'd attempted to move in years. But as she looked at the family she'd rescued, she knew that failure simply wasn't an option. Gripping the handle of the cart tightly, Clara began the long, slow journey home. The wind howled around her, the snow pelting her face, but she barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to the rhythmic crunch of her boots in the snow and the precious cargo behind her. Step by painstaking step, Clara made her way through the deserted streets of Havenwood. The trek seemed endless, her arms and back screaming in protest, but she refused to give up. More than once, she had to stop to catch her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. But each time, a soft whimper from the cart would reach her ears, spurring her on. Finally, after what felt like hours, Clara's house came into view. The porch light, which she'd left on in her haste to return to the dogs, shone like a beacon in the swirling snow. With a final burst of energy, Clara pushed the cart up the driveway and onto the porch. As she fumbled with her keys once more, Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. They'd made it. Against all odds, she'd managed to bring this abandoned family to safety. Once inside, Clara's small living room quickly transformed into an impromptu animal shelter. She laid out blankets by the fireplace, creating a warm, soft nest for the mother dog and her puppies. Carefully, she transferred each puppy from the cart to the blankets, counting as she went to ensure none were left behind. The mother dog, whom Clara had started thinking of as Grace for her quiet dignity in the face of adversity, watched the proceedings with tired eyes. Once all her puppies were safely on the blankets, she gingerly stepped out of the cart and curled up beside them, immediately beginning to clean and warm them with gentle licks. Clara worked tirelessly, her own discomfort forgotten in the face of the animals' needs. She brought bowls of warm water and soft food for Grace, helping her drink when it became clear the dog was too weak to manage on her own. She gently toweled off each puppy, rubbing life back into their tiny bodies. As the fire crackled merrily in the hearth and the storm raged on outside, Clara finally allowed herself to sink into her favorite armchair. She watched Grace tending to her puppies, marveling at the resilience of this little family. Looking at them now, safe and warm in her living room, Clara felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since her husband's passing 3 years ago. She knew the road ahead would be challenging. 7 dogs were a lot for anyone to handle, let alone a widow in her 60s. But as Grace looked up at her with those soulful brown eyes, Clara knew she'd made the right decision. "Welcome home," she whispered, a tired smile playing on her lips. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside Clara's cozy house, a new day was dawning, for her, for Grace, and for the 6 tiny puppies who had yet to open their eyes to the world that had so nearly rejected them. As Clara drifted off to sleep in her chair, lulled by the soft sounds of the puppies nursing and the steady rhythm of Grace's breathing, she couldn't help but feel that this unexpected turn of events was the beginning of something truly special. Little did she know just how much her life, and the lives of everyone in Havenwood, were about to change, all because of a chance discovery in a snowstorm. The days following Grace and her puppy's rescue were a whirlwind of activity for Clara. Her once quiet home now buzzed with the sounds of whimpering puppies and the gentle padding of Grace's paws on the hardwood floors. Clara found herself thrust into a new role, part nurse, part zookeeper, and full-time caregiver to 7 dogs who depended on her for everything. The morning after the rescue, Clara woke early, her body stiff and sore from the previous day's exertions. For a moment, as she blinked away the remnants of sleep, she wondered if it had all been a dream. But then she heard it, the soft whine of a puppy, followed by the gentle shushing sounds of Grace tending to her brood. With a groan, Clara pushed herself out of bed. Well, she muttered to herself, no rest for the weary, I suppose. As she made her way to the living room, she was greeted by a sight that made her heart swell. Grace, looking a bit better after a night of rest and food, was curled protectively around her puppies. When she saw Clara, her tail thumped weakly against the blankets, a gesture of trust and gratitude that brought tears to Clara's eyes. Good morning, sweet girl, Clara said softly, kneeling down to stroke Grace's head. How are you and the little ones doing today? As if in response, one of the puppies let out a tiny yip, causing Clara to chuckle. I'll take that as a good sign, she said. But as Clara looked more closely at Grace, her smile faded. In the harsh light of day, it was clear that the dog was in worse shape than she'd initially thought. Grace's ribs were visible beneath her matted fur, and there was a dullness to her eyes that spoke of more than just physical exhaustion. Oh, honey, Clara murmured, gently running her hands along Grace's body. We need to get you to a vet, and soon. With a determination that surprised even herself, Clara sprang into action. She called the local veterinary clinic, explaining the situation in a rush of words. Dr. Sarah Johnson, the town's trusted vet for over 2 decades, listened patiently before assuring Clara she'd make a house call as soon as she could navigate the snow-covered streets. While waiting for Dr. Johnson, Clara busied herself with caring for her new charges. She warmed some milk for the puppies, using a small syringe to carefully feed each one. Grace watched attentively, her eyes never leaving her babies. You're a good mama, Clara told her, reaching out to scratch behind Grace's ears. Don't you worry. We're going to get you all fixed up. A knock at the door announced Dr. Johnson's arrival. The vet, a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair and a kind smile, stomped the snow from her boots before entering. Clara Thompson, she said, shaking her head in amazement as she surveyed the scene. When you called, I thought you might be exaggerating. But I see you've got yourself a regular canine maternity ward here. Clara laughed, feeling a bit sheepish. I couldn't just leave them out there, Sarah. You should have seen them, half buried in the snow. Dr. Johnson's face softened. You did the right thing, Clara. Now, let's take a look at our patients, shall we? The next hour was filled with gentle examinations, soft words of encouragement, and the occasional yelp from a startled puppy. Dr. Johnson's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking each dog thoroughly. Finally, she straightened up with a sigh. Well, the good news is that the puppies seem to be in relatively good health, considering what they've been through. They're a bit underweight and will need special care, but I think they'll pull through just fine. Clara nodded, relief flooding through her. But she couldn't help noticing the concern still etched on Dr. Johnson's face. And Grace? She asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Dr. Johnson's expression turned grave. I'm afraid Grace's condition is more serious. She's severely malnourished, and I'm concerned about some lumps I found during the examination. I'd like to run some tests, but... She hesitated, glancing at Clara. Clara, I have to warn you. Given her condition and what you've told me about how you found her, there's a possibility we might be dealing with something more serious than just neglect. Clara felt her heart sink. What do you mean? I don't want to speculate too much without proper tests, Dr. Johnson said gently, but conditions like bone cancer can sometimes present with symptoms similar to what we're seeing in Grace. I think it's important we get her to the clinic for a more thorough examination as soon as possible. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Cancer. It seemed impossibly cruel that this gentle creature, who had already endured so much, might be facing such a dire diagnosis. What can we do? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Johnson placed a comforting hand on Clara's shoulder. "First, we'll run the tests. Once we know what we're dealing with, we can discuss treatment options. But Clara," she added, her voice serious, "I want you to be prepared. Even in the best-case scenario, Grace's recovery is going to be a long and potentially expensive process. And with 6 puppies to care for as well." Clara straightened her spine, a fierce determination settling over her. "Whatever it takes, Sarah. I made a promise to Grace when I found her, and I intend to keep it. We'll find a way." Dr. Johnson nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I had a feeling you'd say that. All right then, let's get started. I'll make some calls and see if we can get Grace to the clinic today for those tests." As Dr. Johnson stepped outside to make her calls, Clara settled down next to Grace, gently stroking her fur. "Did you hear that, girl? We're going to get you all fixed up. You just focus on taking care of these little ones, okay?" Grace responded by licking Clara's hand, her brown eyes full of trust. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. How could anyone have abandoned this sweet dog? She silently vowed to do whatever it took to give Grace and her puppies the life they deserved. The next few days passed in a blur of vet visits, late-night feedings, and more loads of laundry than Clara had done in years. The puppies, growing stronger by the day, began to show their individual personalities. Clara found herself giving them names almost without realizing it. There was Max, the largest of the litter, always first in line for food and already showing signs of a mischievous streak. Bella, the smallest, was shy and sweet, often found curled up closest to Grace. Scout was the curious one, always sniffing around and exploring his surroundings. Daisy was a bundle of energy, constantly tumbling over her siblings in her excitement. Luna was the peacekeeper, often placing herself between squabbling siblings. And finally, there was Rocky, who seemed to have inherited his mother's gentle nature and soulful eyes. As for Grace, the test results confirmed Dr. Johnson's fears. The beautiful golden retriever was indeed suffering from bone cancer, already in an advanced stage. The news hit Clara hard, but she refused to give up hope. "We'll make whatever time she has left the best it can be," she told Dr. Johnson firmly, even as tears threatened to spill from her eyes. Word of Clara's rescue and Grace's condition spread quickly through Havenwood. It was Mary Beth from the grocery store who first showed up on Clara's doorstep, arms laden with dog food and puppy supplies. "Least I could do," she said gruffly when Clara tried to thank her. "You need anything else, you just let me know." After that, it seemed like the whole town rallied around Clara and her canine family. Tom and his son Ethan from the hardware store came by to build a secure pen for the puppies in Clara's backyard. Sarah, the librarian, organized a schedule for volunteers to help with feedings and care, giving Clara much-needed breaks. Even grumpy old Mr. Hendricks, known for his dislike of anything that disrupted his routine, was seen sneaking treats to Grace when he thought no one was looking. Clara was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Her house, once a quiet refuge that sometimes felt too big and empty, was now filled with the sounds of barking puppies, laughing volunteers, and the constant hum of activity. She found herself rediscovering a sense of purpose and connection to her community that she hadn't felt since her husband's passing. One evening, as Clara sat on her porch watching the puppies play in their new pen, she felt a presence beside her. It was Emily, a young woman who had recently moved to town and had become one of the most dedicated volunteers. "They're really something, aren't they?" Emily said, nodding towards the puppies. "It's amazing how much they've grown already." Clara nodded, a proud smile on her face. "They're fighters, just like their mama." Emily was quiet for a moment, then turned to Clara with a serious expression. "You know, what you're doing here, it's really incredible. You've not only saved these dogs, but you've brought the whole town together." Clara felt her cheeks warm at the praise. "Oh, I don't know about that. I just did what anyone would do." "But that's just it," Emily insisted. "Not everyone would have done what you did. You saw a need and you didn't hesitate to help, even when it meant turning your whole life upside down. That's special, Clara." As if sensing she was being talked about, Grace padded over to where Clara and Emily sat today. She rested her head on Clara's lap, looking up at her with those soulful brown eyes. Clara felt her heart swell with love for this gentle creature who had come into her life so unexpectedly. "You know," Clara said softly, stroking Grace's head, "I think Grace and her puppies have given me far more than I could ever give them. They've given me a new beginning, a new purpose." Emily smiled, reaching out to pat Grace's back. "I think you've given each other exactly what you needed." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Clara looked out over her backyard. The puppies were settling down for the night, curling up together in a pile of fuzzy bodies. Grace, ever the attentive mother, made one last round to check on each of her babies before coming to sit at Clara's feet. In that moment, surrounded by the fruits of her unexpected adventure, Clara felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what challenges tomorrow might bring. Grace's health was still a concern, and raising 6 puppies was no small task. But she knew that whatever came, she wouldn't face it alone. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Clara made a silent promise to herself, to Grace, and to the puppies. This was indeed a new beginning, and she was determined to make the most of every moment of it. With a contented sigh, she stood up, gently urging Grace inside. "Come on, girl," she said softly. "Let's go home." And as Clara closed the door behind them, she couldn't help but feel that home had taken on a whole new meaning. One filled with wet noses, wagging tails, and more love than she had ever thought possible. As the weeks passed, the puppies grew stronger and more active, their personalities blossoming under Clara's care. Max, the largest of the litter, had become quite the troublemaker, always finding new ways to escape the pen and explore Clara's backyard. Bella, still the shyest, had formed a special bond with Clara, often curling up in her lap during quiet evenings. Scout's curiosity had only grown, his little nose constantly twitching as he investigated every nook and cranny of his expanding world. Daisy's energy seemed boundless, keeping Clara on her toes with her playful antics. Luna continued to be the peacekeeper, often intervening when play got too rough among her siblings. And Rocky, with his soulful eyes so like his mother's, had become a favorite among the volunteers for his gentle nature. Grace, despite her declining health, watched over her brood with unwavering devotion. Her condition had stabilized somewhat under Dr. Johnson's care, but the cancer continued its relentless advance. Clara tried to push away the nagging worry about what would happen when, if. No, she couldn't bring herself to finish that thought. One sunny afternoon, as Clara sat on her porch watching the puppies romp in the yard, she was surprised to see a group of people making their way up her driveway. Leading the pack was Mayor Jim Thompson, no relation to Clara, despite sharing a last name, his round face creased with a broad smile. Behind him were several members of the town council, as well as Dr. Johnson and Emily. "Well, hello there," Mayor Thompson called out, waving enthusiastically. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." Clara stood, brushing dog hair from her jeans. "Not at all, Jim. What brings you all out here today?" The group gathered around Clara's porch, an air of excitement palpable among them. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat importantly. "Clara," he began, "we've come here today because, well, you've inspired us. What you've done for Grace and her puppies, it's touched the hearts of everyone in Havenwood." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "Oh, Jim, I just did what anyone would do." "But that's just it," Emily chimed in, her eyes shining. "Not everyone would have done what you did. And now, we want to do something too." Dr. Johnson stepped forward, a folder in her hands. "Clara, we've been talking, and we think we've come up with a way to help. We want to create what we're calling the Grace Fund. Clara blinked, confusion evident on her face. "The Grace Fund? What's that?" Mayor Thompson's smile widened. "It's a community initiative to cover the medical expenses and care for Grace and her puppies. We've already started raising money, and the response has been overwhelming." Clara felt her knees go weak, and she sank back into her porch chair. I don't know what to say," she stammered, tears pricking at her eyes. Dr. Johnson sat next to her, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "You don't have to say anything, Clara. We all want to help. This fund will ensure that Grace gets the best possible care, and that her puppies have everything they need as they grow." As if sensing she was being talked about, Grace padded over to the porch, her tail wagging slowly. The group parted to let her through, and she rested her head on Clara's lap, looking up at her with those soulful brown eyes. Clara stroked Grace's head, her voice thick with emotion. "You hear that, girl? Looks like you've got a whole town looking out for you now." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as news of the Grace Fund spread through Havenwood. The local diner, Mabel's Place, started donating a percentage of their profits to the fund. The high school art class, under the guidance of their teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, created Grace and Puppies themed merchandise to sell at the upcoming town fair. Even the children got involved, with lemonade stands popping up on street corners, their hand-drawn signs proudly proclaiming all proceeds go to the Grace Fund. Clara watched it all with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. She'd always known that Havenwood was a special place, but the outpouring of support still took her breath away. One evening, as Clara sat on her porch swing with Grace at her feet, Emily came by with an update on the fund. "Clara, you won't believe this," she said, her eyes wide with excitement. "We've already raised enough to cover all of Grace's treatments for the next 6 months, plus enough left over to start a savings account for the puppy's future care." Clara felt her heart swell with emotion. "Emily, that's incredible. I don't know how to thank everyone." Emily smiled, sitting down next to Clara. "You don't have to thank anyone. This is what communities do, we take care of our own. And Grace, she's become a part of Havenwood now." As if to emphasize Emily's point, a car drove by at that moment, slowing as it passed Clara's house. The driver, Mrs. Peterson from the post office, waved enthusiastically. "How's our girl doing today?" she called out. Clara waved back, a lump forming in her throat. "She's doing just fine, thanks." As Mrs. Peterson drove away, Clara turned to Emily. "You know, when I first found Grace and the puppies, I was worried about how I'd manage. I never imagined anything like this." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's amazing how one act of kindness can ripple out and affect so many people. You didn't just save Grace and her puppies, Clara. You reminded all of us what it means to be a community." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the backyard. They looked over to see Max, true to form, attempting to scale the fence of the puppy pen. His siblings watched with what could only be described as a mix of admiration and confusion. Clara couldn't help but laugh. "That one's going to be trouble," she said, shaking her head fondly. Emily grinned. "I don't know, I think he's got the right idea. Always reaching for something more, you know?" As they watched, Grace made her way over to the pen. With a gentle nudge, she guided Max away from the fence, redirecting his attention to a chew toy. The other puppies immediately swarmed around their mother, vying for her attention. "She's such a good mom," Clara said softly. "Even with everything she's going through, she always puts them first." Emily nodded, her expression serious. "That's why we all want to help. Grace has shown us what real strength and love look like. The least we can do is make sure she and her puppies are taken care of." The success of the Grace Fund inspired even more initiatives in Havenwood. The local pet store, Paws and Claws, started a program to provide free puppy training classes for all adopted dogs. The town's annual summer festival was rebranded as Grace's Day, with activities centered around pet adoption and animal welfare. Clara found herself at the center of it all, often being asked to speak at events or provide updates on Grace and the puppies. Despite her initial discomfort with the attention, she grew to appreciate the platform it gave her to advocate for animal welfare. One particularly memorable event was the Parade of Paws, a pet parade organized as part of Grace's Day. Clara, with Grace by her side and the puppies following in a beautifully decorated wagon, led the procession through the streets of Havenwood. The sidewalks were lined with cheering residents, many holding signs with messages of support for Grace and her family. As they passed the town square, Clara caught sight of Mr. Hendricks, the town's resident grump. To her surprise, he was standing at the edge of the crowd, a small smile on his usually stern face. When Grace passed by, he reached out to pat her head, his weathered hand gentle on her golden fur. The parade ended in the park, where a small stage had been set up. Mayor Thompson, his face red from the summer heat but beaming with pride, took to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming across the gathered crowd, I want to thank you all for coming out today to support the Grace Fund. Thanks to your generosity, we've not only been able to provide for Grace and her puppies, but we've also raised enough to start a permanent fund for animal welfare in Havenwood." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. She looked down at Grace, who was sitting calmly by her side despite the noise and excitement. "You hear that, girl? You've started something pretty special here." As the summer wore on, Grace's condition continued to deteriorate, despite the best efforts of Dr. Johnson and her team. There were good days, where Grace seemed almost her old self, playing with her puppies in the yard or going for short walks around the neighborhood. But there were also bad days, where the pain seemed to overwhelm her, and all she could do was lie in her bed, accepting gentle pets and soft words of comfort from Clara and the volunteers. Through it all, the support from the community never wavered. When word got out that Grace was having trouble eating, the local butcher started sending over specially prepared meals. When the puppies outgrew their pen, the high school woodshop class built a new, larger one as a summer project. One evening, as Clara sat on her porch swing, Grace's head in her lap, she reflected on the journey of the past few months. The quiet, somewhat lonely life she'd been living seemed like a distant memory now. Her days were filled with the chaos and joy of raising 6 rambunctious puppies, the constant flow of volunteers and well-wishers, and the deep, abiding love she felt for the gentle golden retriever who had changed everything. "You know, Grace," she said softly, stroking the dog's silky ears, "when I found you that day in the snow, I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, you saved me too. You've given me a new purpose, a new family. And look at what you've done for this town. You've reminded us all of the power of compassion and community." Grace looked up at her, those soulful brown eyes filled with understanding. She gave Clara's hand a gentle lick, as if to say, "I know. Thank you." As the sun set over Havenwood, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Clara felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. She had Grace, the puppies, and an entire town standing beside her. The Grace Fund had started as a way to help one dog and her puppies, but it had grown into something much more. It had become a symbol of what was possible when a community came together, a reminder of the difference one act of kindness could make. As Clara stood to go inside, Grace following slowly behind her, she paused for a moment, looking out over the town she'd called home for so many years. Havenwood had always been a special place, but now, thanks to a golden retriever named Grace, it shone even brighter. And Clara knew, with absolute certainty, that the best was yet to come. As autumn painted Havenwood in a riot of reds, oranges, and golds, the reality of Grace's condition became impossible to ignore. Despite the best efforts of Dr. Johnson and the outpouring of support from the Grace Fund, the cancer was progressing. Grace's good days were becoming fewer and farther between, and Clara found herself cherishing every moment with the gentle golden retriever who had changed her life. It was during one of Dr. Johnson's regular checkups that the idea first took root. As the vet gently examined Grace, her hands moving with practiced care over the dog's thin frame, she turned to Clara with a thoughtful expression. "Clara," she said softly, "I think it's time we start thinking about quality of life rather than just treatment. Grace has fought so hard, but—" Clara nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered. I want her last days to be special, you know? She deserves that much." Dr. Johnson's eyes lit up. "You know, that gives me an idea. Have you ever heard of a bucket list?" And so, the idea of Grace's bucket list was born. Word spread quickly through Havenwood, and soon the whole town was abuzz with suggestions and offers to help. Emily, ever the organizer, set up a meeting at the community center to brainstorm ideas. The turnout was overwhelming. It seemed like half the town had shown up, from kids still in their school uniforms to retirees leaning on canes. The air was thick with a mix of excitement and solemnity as everyone understood the bittersweet nature of the task at hand. Mayor Thompson stood at the front of the room, a whiteboard marker in hand. "All right, folks," he said, his usually booming voice softened with emotion. "Let's hear your ideas for Grace's bucket list. What experiences do we want to give our girl in her final days?" The ideas came pouring in. Some were simple: A day at the park with unlimited tennis balls. Others were more elaborate, a doggy fashion show where Grace would be the guest of honor. Each suggestion was met with nods of approval and soft murmurs of agreement. As Clara listened to her neighbors and friends share their ideas, she felt a warmth bloom in her chest. This was so much more than she could have ever imagined when she first found Grace in that snowdrift. This was a community coming together to celebrate life, even in the face of impending loss. With the list compiled, the town set about making Grace's dreams come true, even if they were dreams she didn't know she had. The first item on the list was a picnic in the park. On a crisp Saturday morning, Clara loaded Grace and the puppies, now nearly full-grown but still full of energy, into her old station wagon. As they pulled up to the park, Clara gasped in surprise. The entire area had been transformed. Colorful blankets dotted the grass, each one laden with treats, both for humans and dogs. A banner strung between two trees proclaimed Grace's day in the park in big, cheerful letters. And everywhere she looked, Clara saw familiar faces, friends, neighbors, and even a few folks she only knew by sight, all gathered to make this day special for Grace. As Clara helped Grace out of the car, she was immediately surrounded by well-wishers. Grace, despite her weakened state, seemed to perk up at all the attention. Her tail wagged slowly but steadily as she accepted pets and treats from her adoring fans. The puppies, now old enough to be off-leash, bounded across the grass, their excited yips filling the air. Max, true to form, made a beeline for the treat table, while Bella shyly stuck close to Clara's legs. Scout sniffed every inch of the park as if cataloguing it for future reference, while Daisy zoomed from person to person, accepting belly rubs with gleeful abandon. Luna, ever the peacekeeper, kept a watchful eye on her siblings, while Rocky seemed content to simply bask in the sunshine. The day was filled with simple pleasures. Grace lounged on a soft blanket, surrounded by a constantly rotating group of admirers. She accepted each pat and scratch with regal grace, her brown eyes soft with contentment. Clara sat nearby, alternating between keeping an eye on the puppies and chatting with friends. As the afternoon wore on, Mr. Hendricks approached Clara, a paper bag clutched in his gnarled hands. "Miss Clara," he said gruffly, I made these for Grace." He thrust the bag towards her. Curious, Clara peered inside. The bag was filled with homemade dog biscuits, each one carefully shaped into a little bone. "Mr. Hendricks," she said, touched by the gesture, "I didn't know you baked." The old man's cheeks reddened slightly. "Well, don't go spreading it around," he muttered. "But I figured the old girl deserved something special." Clara's heart swelled as she watched Mr. Hendricks kneel down, with some difficulty, to offer Grace one of his homemade treats. The sight of the town's notorious Grump gently feeding cookies to a dog would have been unthinkable just a few months ago. Yet here they were, all brought together by one remarkable golden retriever. The next item on Grace's bucket list was a swim in the lake. Despite the cooling temperatures, the town rallied to make it happen. The local fire department volunteered to fill kiddie pools with warm water for Grace to splash in, while the high school swim team stood by as lifeguards, just in case. Clara worried that the activity might be too much for Grace, but as soon as the dog's paws touched the water, years seemed to melt away. With a burst of energy Clara hadn't seen in weeks, Grace paddled through the pools, her tail wagging furiously. The puppies, unsure at first, soon joined in, turning the whole thing into a joyous, splashy free-for-all. Watching from the sidelines, Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. Emily, noticing her emotion, wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "She looks so happy," Clara whispered. Emily squeezed her gently. "That's because of you, Clara. You gave her this chance at happiness." As autumn deepened, the town worked their way through Grace's bucket list. There was a doggy ice cream social at the local parlor, where Grace sampled every flavor, and the puppies made a magnificent mess. The elementary school held a Read to Grace Day, where kids took turns reading their favorite stories to the patient dog. One particularly memorable event was the Grace's Day Out ride. Tom from the hardware store had retrofitted his pickup truck with a special padded bed, allowing Grace to ride in comfort and style. With Clara by her side and the puppies safely at home with volunteers, Grace was treated to a tour of Havenwood. They drove past all of Grace's favorite spots, the park where she loved to nap in the sun, the pet store where she always got an extra treat, and even the snow-filled ditch where Clara had first found her. At each stop, townspeople were waiting to wave and cheer. The final stop was the town square, where Mayor Thompson was waiting with a surprise. As Tom's truck pulled up, the mayor unveiled a small bronze statue. It depicted a golden retriever, unmistakably Grace, surrounded by 6 puppies. "This," Mayor Thompson announced to the gathered crowd, "is our tribute to Grace. A reminder of how one act of kindness can change an entire community. From this day forward, this will be known as Grace's Square." Clara, overwhelmed, could only nod her thanks as tears streamed down her face. Grace, sensing her emotion, leaned against her, offering comfort even now. As the days grew shorter and the nights cooler, Clara knew their time with Grace was growing short. But rather than dwelling on the impending loss, she found herself focused on making each day count. The final item on Grace's bucket list was perhaps the most touching of all. The town organized a candlelight vigil in Grace's honor. As dusk fell on a chilly October evening, it seemed like the entire population of Havenwood had gathered in the park. Clara sat on a blanket, Grace's head in her lap, the puppies sprawled around them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mayor Thompson stepped forward, a candle in his hand. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "we're here tonight to honor a very special member of our community. Grace may have come to us by chance, but she has touched all of our lives with purpose." One by one, people stepped forward to light their candles and share a memory or a word of thanks. Emily spoke of how Grace had inspired her to volunteer at the local animal shelter. Mr. Hendricks, in a rare display of emotion, thanked Grace for teaching an old dog new tricks about kindness. As the night wore on and the park glowed with the warm light of hundreds of candles, Clara looked down at Grace. The old dog's eyes were heavy with sleep, but there was a contentment in them that brought a lump to Clara's throat. "You see, girl," she whispered, leaning down to press a kiss to Grace's forehead. "You're so loved. So very loved." Grace's tail thumped weakly against the blanket, a quiet acknowledgement of Clara's words and the love that surrounded them. As the last candle flickered in the night breeze, Clara realized that Grace's bucket list had become about so much more than just making a dying dog's last days special. It had become a celebration of life, of community, and of the incredible capacity for love that exists in the most unexpected places. Grace might be nearing the end of her journey, but her legacy, a town brought together, lives changed, and hearts opened, would live on long after she was gone. And as Clara sat there, surrounded by the warmth of her community and the love of her canine family, she knew that no matter what tomorrow brought, they had already been given the greatest gift of all, the gift of today, lived fully and with love. As November settled over Havenwood, bringing with it a chill that seemed to seep into bones and hearts alike, Clara found herself facing the inevitable. Grace's condition had deteriorated rapidly in the weeks following the candlelight vigil. The once energetic golden retriever now spent most of her days curled up in her bed, her breathing labored and her eyes, though still filled with love, clouded with pain. Dr. Johnson had become a near-constant presence in Clara's home, her visits increasing from weekly to daily as Grace's health declined. On a particularly gloomy Tuesday morning, as rain pattered softly against the windows, the vet took Clara aside after examining Grace. "Clara," she said gently, her eyes filled with compassion, "I think it's time we start considering, well, making Grace comfortable. We've done everything we can, but..." Clara nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She'd known this day was coming, had tried to prepare herself for it, but the reality still hit her like a physical blow. How long?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Johnson squeezed her hand. "It's hard to say for certain, but I'd be surprised if it's more than a few days. I'm so sorry, Clara. I know how much she means to you, to all of us." Clara took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing herself to stay composed. "What do we do now?" "We make her as comfortable as possible," Dr. Johnson replied. "Keep her warm, give her all the love and attention you can. And when the time comes, we'll make sure she doesn't suffer." As Dr. Johnson left, promising to return later that day, Clara made her way back to Grace's bed. The puppies, now nearly full-grown dogs themselves, were sprawled around their mother, as if trying to lend her their strength. They looked up as Clara approached, their eyes seeming to reflect her own sorrow. Clara knelt beside Grace, gently stroking her soft golden fur. "Hey there, sweet girl," she murmured. "How are you feeling?" Grace's tail thumped weakly against the bed, a pale echo of her once enthusiastic wags. She lifted her head slightly, nuzzling into Clara's hand. The simple gesture of affection, even now, brought tears to Clara's eyes. "Oh, Grace," she whispered, leaning down to press a kiss to the dog's forehead. "You've been so brave, so strong. It's okay to rest now. We're all here with you." As if understanding Clara's words, Grace let out a soft sigh, her body relaxing slightly. Clara settled herself more comfortably on the floor, prepared to stay by Grace's side for as long as necessary. Word of Grace's declining health spread quickly through Havenwood. Despite the dreary weather, a steady stream of visitors began to arrive at Clara's door. They came in ones and twos, quiet and respectful, each wanting to say goodbye to the dog who had touched their lives in such profound ways. Emily was among the first to arrive, her arms laden with Grace's favorite treats and a soft new blanket. "I thought she might like this," she said softly, draping the blanket over Grace. "It's extra cozy." Mr. Hendricks shuffled in later that afternoon, looking uncomfortable in the emotional atmosphere but determined to be there. He knelt awkwardly beside Grace's bed, his gnarled hand gently patting her head. "You're a good dog," he said gruffly, his voice thick with unshed tears. "A real good dog." Mayor Thompson stopped by with his wife, bringing a casserole for Clara and a bag of premium dog food for Grace. "Just in case she feels up to eating," he explained, though they all knew it was unlikely. As evening fell, Clara's living room had transformed into a quiet vigil. Friends and neighbors sat in hushed groups, sharing memories of Grace and offering support to Clara. The puppies, sensing the somber mood, were unusually subdued, curling up close to their mother or seeking comfort from the gathered humans. Clara barely left Grace's side, her hand constantly stroking the dog's fur, murmuring words of love and comfort. Dr. Johnson checked in periodically, adjusting Grace's pain medication to ensure she remained as comfortable as possible. As midnight approached and the last of the visitors reluctantly departed, promising to return in the morning, Clara found herself alone with Grace and the puppies. The house was quiet save for the soft sounds of breathing and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Clara leaned back against the wall, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but unwilling to sleep. She looked at Grace, remembering the day she had found her in the snow, scared and alone. "You've come so far, sweet girl," she whispered. "You've touched so many lives. Mine most of all." As if hearing her words, Grace stirred slightly. With what seemed like tremendous effort, she lifted her head, her brown eyes finding Clara's. For a moment, it was as if all the pain and illness fell away, and Clara saw the same bright spirit that had captured her heart all those months ago. Grace's tail thumped once, twice against the bed. Then, with a soft sigh, she laid her head back down, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. Clara felt a change in the air, a shift so subtle she might have missed it if she hadn't been so attuned to Grace's every breath. "It's okay, girl," she said softly, her voice breaking. "If you need to go, it's okay. We'll be all right. You've given us so much." The puppies, sensing something was happening, began to stir. One by one, they approached their mother, nuzzling her gently. Max, the troublemaker, licked Grace's face softly. Bella, still the shyest, curled up tight against Grace's side. Scout sniffed carefully at his mother, as if trying to memorize her scent. Daisy, for once, was still, her head resting on Grace's paw. Luna positioned herself at Grace's back, a steadfast presence. And Rocky, so like his mother in temperament, gazed at Grace with those soulful eyes, a mirror of her own. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Grace took one final, shuddering breath. Her eyes, fixed on Clara until the very end, slowly closed. The room fell into a deep, profound silence. Clara sat motionless for a long moment, her hand still resting on Grace's now still form. Then, as the reality of the loss washed over her, she began to weep. Great, heaving sobs shook her body as she curled herself around Grace, burying her face in the soft golden fur. The puppies, understanding in that innate way that animals do, began to whine softly. They pressed close to Clara and their mother, offering and seeking comfort in equal measure. Clara wasn't sure how long she sat there, lost in her grief. It could have been minutes or hours. She was vaguely aware of the sun rising, of the sounds of the town waking up outside. But in that moment, her world had narrowed to this room, to the still form of the dog who had changed everything. A soft knock at the door finally roused her. Wiping her eyes, Clara called out a hoarse, "Come in." Dr. Johnson entered quietly, taking in the scene with a glance. Without a word, she knelt beside Clara, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She's gone," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Johnson nodded, her own eyes glistening with tears. "She waited for you," she said gently. "She held on until she knew you were ready to let her go. That's the kind of love Grace had, selfless to the very end." Clara nodded, unable to speak. She stroked Grace's fur one last time, marveling at how peaceful she looked. It was as if all the pain and illness had been washed away, leaving behind only the memory of the brave, loving dog she had been. As the morning wore on, word of Grace's passing spread through Havenwood. Despite the early hour, people began to gather at Clara's house. They came bearing food, flowers, and most importantly, memories of Grace. Emily organized a rotation of volunteers to help care for the puppies, understanding that Clara would need time to grieve. Mayor Thompson stopped by to offer his condolences and to discuss plans for a memorial service. "Grace wasn't just your dog, Clara," he said kindly. "She became a symbol of hope and community for all of Havenwood. We'd like to honor her properly, if you're okay with that." Clara nodded, touched by the gesture. I think Grace would like that," she said softly. As the day progressed, Clara found herself surrounded by a cocoon of support. Friends and neighbors shared stories of how Grace had touched their lives, each tale a testament to the impact one dog could have on an entire community. Mr. Hendricks, in a move that shocked everyone, announced his intention to adopt one of Grace's puppies. "Well," he said gruffly when met with surprised looks, "someone's got to carry on her legacy, don't they?" As evening fell once more, Clara sat on her porch, the same porch where she had spent so many hours with Grace. The puppies were inside, being cared for by volunteers. For the first time in months, Clara was alone. She looked out over the town, at the lights flickering on in windows, at the people going about their evening routines. Everything looked the same, and yet everything had changed. Grace was gone, and the loss felt like a physical ache in Clara's chest. But as she sat there, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the darkening sky, she felt something else too. Gratitude. Gratitude for the time she'd had with Grace, for the love they'd shared, for the way one abandoned dog had brought an entire community together. "Thank you, Grace," she whispered to the night sky. "For everything." And somewhere, in the rustle of leaves and the soft night breeze, Clara could almost hear a response. The gentle thump of a wagging tail, a reminder that love, once given, never truly dies. The day after Grace's passing dawned clear and crisp, the kind of autumn morning that would have had the golden retriever wagging her tail in anticipation of a long walk. As Clara stood in her kitchen, mechanically going through the motions of making coffee, the absence of the familiar click of Grace's nails on the hardwood floor was deafening. A soft whine drew her attention, and she looked down to see Rocky, the puppy who most resembled Grace in both looks and temperament, gazing up at her with soulful eyes. Clara felt a lump form in her throat as she knelt to scratch behind his ears. "I miss her too, Buddy," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. A knock at the door roused Clara from her reverie. She opened it to find Emily standing on the porch, a casserole dish in her hands and a gentle smile on her face. "Thought you could use some breakfast," Emily said softly, stepping inside. "How are you holding up?" Clara shrugged, attempting a weak smile. "I'm managing," she replied. "It's just so quiet without her." Emily nodded sympathetically, setting the casserole on the kitchen counter. "I can't even imagine. But Clara, you should know, the whole town is talking about the memorial service. Everyone wants to be there to honor Grace." The memorial service. Clara had almost forgotten about Mayor Thompson's suggestion the day before. The thought of facing the entire town, of having to say goodbye to Grace in such a public way, was overwhelming. Sensing her hesitation, Emily placed a comforting hand on Clara's arm. "You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with," she assured her. But I think it might be good for you. For all of us. Grace touched so many lives, Clara. This is a chance for everyone to come together and celebrate that. Clara took a deep breath, nodding slowly. You're right, she said. Grace deserves to be remembered. And I think it might help to be surrounded by people who loved her too. Over the next few days, the town of Havenwood came together in a flurry of activity, all centered around honoring Grace's memory. The local florist donated bouquets of sunflowers, Grace's favorite. The high school woodshop class, led by their teacher Mr. Rodriguez, worked tirelessly to create a beautiful wooden urn for Grace's ashes. Even Mr. Hendricks, still adjusting to life with his newly adopted puppy, he'd chosen Bella, much to everyone's surprise, could be seen hanging posters announcing the memorial service. On the day of the service, Clara stood in front of her mirror, smoothing down her black dress with trembling hands. The puppies, now nearly 9 months old, milled around her feet, sensing the importance of the day. Come on, guys, she said softly. It's time to go say goodbye to your mom. The town square had been transformed for the occasion. Rows of chairs faced a small podium, behind which stood the bronze statue of Grace that had been unveiled during her day-out ride. Flowers surrounded the base of the statue, their bright colors a stark contrast to the somber mood. As Clara approached, leading the puppies on their leashes, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. Every face turned towards her, eyes filled with sympathy and shared grief. Clara felt her steps falter, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. But then, as if sent by Grace herself, a warm breeze ruffled through the square. It carried with it the scent of late autumn, crisp leaves and wood smoke, and seemed to wrap around Clara like a comforting hug. She straightened her shoulders and continued forward, the puppies padding faithfully beside her. Mayor Thompson stepped up to the podium as Clara took her seat in the front row. He cleared his throat, his usual booming voice softened with emotion. Friends, neighbors, members of the Havenwood community, he began. We're gathered here today to remember and honor a very special soul. Grace came into our lives unexpectedly, a golden ray of sunshine on a cold winter's day. And though her time with us was far too short, the impact she made will last a lifetime. As the mayor continued, sharing stories of Grace's bravery and the way she had brought the town together, Clara found herself transported back to that snowy day when she'd first found Grace. She remembered the fear in the dog's eyes, the way she'd huddled protectively over her puppies. And she remembered the moment Grace had first wagged her tail, a gesture of trust that had marked the beginning of their journey together. One by one, members of the community stood to share their memories of Grace. Emily spoke of how Grace had inspired her to volunteer at the local animal shelter. Because of Grace, she said, her voice ringing clear across the square, dozens of animals have found their forever homes. Her legacy of love lives on in each of them. Mr. Hendricks, looking uncomfortable in a suit that seemed a size too small, gruffly recounted how Grace had taught an old dog new tricks about kindness. He looked down at Bella, sitting quietly at his feet, and added, and she left behind a pretty good reminder, too. Dr. Johnson spoke of Grace's bravery throughout her illness, and how she had inspired not just her human caregivers, but other sick animals at the clinic. Grace had a way of comforting those around her, she said, wiping a tear from her eye. Even when she was in pain, she always had a wag and a nuzzle for anyone who needed it. As the speeches continued, Clara felt the hard knot of grief in her chest begin to loosen. Yes, the loss of Grace still hurt. She suspected it always would, to some degree. But hearing how profoundly Grace had touched the lives of so many, Clara felt a sense of pride and gratitude begin to overshadow her sorrow. Finally, it was Clara's turn to speak. As she approached the podium, her steps faltered for a moment. But then she felt it, the same warm breeze from earlier, carrying with it the faintest hint of wet dog and tennis balls. Clara smiled, drawing strength from the memory of her faithful friend. Grace came into my life on what I thought was just another ordinary day, she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. I was a widow, set in my ways, not looking for any grand adventures. But Grace had other plans. Clara went on to recount the story of finding Grace and her puppies, of the challenges and joys of those early days. She spoke of Grace's unwavering love, her patience with her rambunctious puppies, and the way she had opened not just Clara's heart, but the hearts of an entire community. Grace taught us so much, Clara said, her eyes scanning the crowd. She taught us about resilience, about facing adversity with courage and grace, pun intended. A soft chuckle rippled through the audience. But most of all, she taught us about love. The kind of love that doesn't count the cost, that gives freely and fully, even when it hurts. The kind of love that changes lives. As Clara concluded her speech, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Grace may no longer be with us physically, she said, her voice strong and clear, but her spirit lives on. In her puppies, in the Grace Fund that will continue to help animals in need, and in each of us who were lucky enough to know her. So today, as we say goodbye, let's also say thank you. Thank you, Grace, for showing us the true meaning of unconditional love. The service concluded with a moment of silence, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the trees and the occasional sniff from the emotional crowd. As people began to disperse, many stopped to offer Clara a hug, a kind word, or a shared memory of Grace. In the days and weeks that followed, life in Havenwood gradually returned to normal, or rather, a new normal. The Grace Fund continued its work, expanding to support not just animals in need, but also programs that brought therapy dogs to local nursing homes and schools. Clara found herself busier than ever, splitting her time between caring for the now adult puppies and volunteering at the local animal shelter. She discovered that helping other animals in Grace's memory eased her own grief and gave her a renewed sense of purpose. The puppies, too, seemed to carry on their mother's legacy in their own ways. Max, still the troublemaker, became a favorite at the local children's hospital, his antics bringing smiles to the faces of sick kids. Bella, under Mr. Hendrick's gruff but loving care, blossomed into a gentle therapy dog, specializing in comforting elderly patients with dementia. Scout's curiosity led him to become a search and rescue dog. His keen nose and adventurous spirit saving lives in the mountains surrounding Havenwood. Daisy's boundless energy found an outlet in agility training, and she soon became a local celebrity at dog shows. Luna, true to her peacekeeper nature, found her calling as a support dog for veterans with PTSD, her calm presence a balm for troubled souls. And Rocky, so like his mother, stayed with Clara, a constant reminder of the love and joy Grace had brought into her life. As the seasons changed and life moved forward, Clara often found herself sitting on her porch, watching the town go about its business. She would see Mr. Hendricks walking Bella, nodding gruffly at passers-by. She'd spot Emily leading a group of excited kids on a tour of the animal shelter. And everywhere she looked, she saw reminders of Grace, in the wagging tails of dogs being walked, in the increased number of pet-friendly businesses, in the way people stopped to help a stray cat or offer a treat to a neighbor's dog. On one such evening, as the sun set over Havenwood, painting the sky in shades of gold that reminded Clara of Grace's soft fur, she felt that familiar warm breeze ruffle her hair. Closing her eyes, she could almost hear the jingle of Grace's collar, could almost feel the soft weight of her head on her lap. "We're doing okay, girl," she whispered to the twilight air. "You'd be proud of us." And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, Clara knew in her heart that somewhere, somehow, Grace was wagging her tail in agreement. Her time in Havenwood may have been brief, but her legacy of love would live on forever, touching lives and opening hearts for generations to come. In the end, Grace's story wasn't just about one dog, or one woman, or even one town. It was a reminder of the profound impact that love, compassion, and kindness can have, how they can ripple outward, touching lives in ways we may never fully understand. And in Havenwood, every wagging tail, every act of kindness, every life touched by the Grace Fund, was a living testament to the enduring power of Grace's legacy of love.